our goal here is to take a look at what happened when the fighting legitimately broke out. All right, we've seen everything that led up to secession. We've looked at the leaders and the strategies on each side. But we actually now get to the fighting of the U.S. Civil War. Now, similar to most wars, both sides believed that it would be over within a few short months and that the boys would be home by Christmas. That's always the refrain with every single war. Now, it's pretty well established that something was going to happen near Bull Run Creek. And Bull Run Creek is located near the town of Manassas Junction. Here's the first time we see that most battles of the Civil War have two names. The Union named battles after geographic features, hence Bull Run, after the creek, whereas Confederates named them after the nearest settlement, which in this case was Manassas Junction. Union General Irwin McDowell, who has replaced Winfield Scott by this point because Scott simply physically can't be in the field, Irwin McDowell proposed an attack at Manassas Junction, which is 25 miles into Virginia, and he was going to be assisted by William Tecumseh Sherman. Due to the large number of spies and Confederate sympathizers in the capital, word began to spread almost immediately. Hundreds of spectators followed the Union forces, and even brought picnics and eyeglasses with which to watch the battle. They thought it was just going to be a splendid little thing to watch this battle take place. After starting out well for the North, the Confederates rallied behind the heroics of mathematics professor Andrew Jackson, who earned the nickname Stonewall when, apparently, in the face of furious fire, he simply stood his ground and someone yelled out, "There stands Jackson," like a stone wall. And eventually the Union forces retreated. Now, it's not as if this quickly ended things because the Confederates failed to pursue, but it was a Confederate victory. However, many of the Confederates who participated in this early battle had served in the Union Army, so they wore their blue fatigues. It didn't take too long for them to realize that that wasn't going to work, so the Confederates quickly switched to their trademark gray uniforms after this. Now, the following year, a new man is in charge. We'll see that Lincoln really goes through his generals. George B. McClellan, who was nicknamed Little Napoleon, led what was called the Peninsula Campaign, where the army marched towards Richmond on the peninsula formed by the York and James Rivers. And this is the same place where the Battle of Yorktown took place during the Revolution. Remember that on to Richmond is one of the goals to end this war. Now, McClellan demonstrated what Lincoln called a case of the slows, in that he was spooked by the prospect of facing a growing Confederate force. His delay actually caused that force to grow to about 90,000 men. And McClellan faced off against the formidable Robert E. Lee, for one, and Lee was assisted by Stonewall Jackson, who harassed the army, and the cavalry of James Ewell Brown Stuart, or Jeb Stuart. And the result was the 7 Days Battle. Now, Lee suffered from a number of things, including faulty intelligence and faulty maps, and the inability to coordinate his movements. But the battle was considered a victory for the Confederates. Now, 20,000 Confederate soldiers, which was 20% of the army, lay as casualties compared to 16,000 Union soldiers. But it was a Confederate win, because McClellan retreated back to Washington. So in the case of the Eastern Front, or the Eastern Theater, it starts out with Bull Run. That was really all that happened in 1861. The following year is when the Peninsula Campaign took place. What's often forgotten is the so-called Western Theater. All right, Western Theater. And a lot of the Western Theater, for our purposes in the early war, centers around Shiloh Chapel in southwest Tennessee. And it really demonstrates how ferocious the fighting would be in the West, but will also allow one man to serve as an officer of note for those Union forces. Now, remember, start of 1862. Bull Run was really it for the East. But the Western Theater had seen considerable action. Ulysses S. Grant had captured Paducah, Kentucky, which is along the Ohio River. And he basically made Kentucky safe for the Union. So this means that Tennessee now feels threatened. Grant and his naval support launched an assault that was designed to secure Nashville, and he also led an assault on Fort Donelson. When Grant besieged Fort Donelson and offered the terms, all right, the Confederate commander said, "Sir, what are your terms?" Grant famously replied, "Nothing but unconditional and immediate surrender." So because his initials were U.S. Grant, he became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. And as he continued his approach south, he faced off against this force near Shiloh. And in this case, he was assisted by William Tecumseh Sherman, who had been transferred west by this point. The Confederates attacked fiercely from their wooded positions, and even though Grant's men held, they were forced to retreat due to the Confederate artillery that had encircled them. Grant had performed well enough to the point where reinforcements arrived, and Grant did successfully counterattack. But 13,000 dead was a number that the Eastern press really seized upon. Interestingly enough, Sidney Johnston, the Confederate officer who had fought Grant at Shiloh and was as aggressive as he was, died from a wound during that fighting. And realistically, he might have been a counter for Grant's tenacity. Grant spent the next 2 years in the Western Theater. Now, the criticism he received of his actions at Shiloh really bothered him, and he's going to defend his actions up until his death. However, Shiloh proved to him what it would take to win the war, and it also demonstrated what he could expect out of his men. Up to this point, at least for Grant, he thought that a decisive victory could be obtained and end the war. So he thought that some type of victory in combat could end the fighting. But to him, Shiloh demonstrated that the only way for the South to lose would be what he called a complete conquest of this region. And this will lay the groundwork for his eventual philosophy of what we call total war.